this year to be reviewed. So we did not have two outside reviewers for every application. We used one reviewer, for example, look at all the law enforcement requests and provide recommendations on those.
So any given application was subject to only one outside reviewer? And that's different from how we've done it in the past, or no?
I'm not sure about, I think last year was that way as well.
Okay. It's different from how we've done it prior to last
Prior
year.
years.
Got it. And then another question, my recollection is that state law requires for certain potential grant recipients to be eligible, they have to be in compliance with the applicable duties for submitting criminal justice information. If I'm not mistaken on that, Director. And we've previously, at least again prior to last year, we've had that information reflected here so we could know whether, for example, a law enforcement agency that may have a terrific grant application is nonetheless out of compliance with the statutory duty to submit criminal justice information. Is that information reflected in here somewhere?
It's not in these documents. The last few years, we've allowed the director to respond to that. And we also have a section in their application narrative where they were to respond to us as to whether or not they were in compliance. And that's not a section I reviewed, so I can't speak directly to that.
I guess I don't really care how it's accounted for. I just want to be sure that the council will have available applicant by applicant, whether they're in compliance or not, because that's a disqualifying characteristic. And I think we need to be aware of that as we look at individual applications, regardless of how strong their application may otherwise be. So will we have, do you have that or do you have that, Director? Okay, thank you. What else on the council? Questions for Jill? No? Anything else we need to know before we proceed?
No, I don't think so. I think you're clear to dive in.
Very good. And is Colonel Jones is online, isn't he? Because I'm looking at a picture of us, which, okay. There he is. Hello, Colonel.
Good morning.
Very good. Council, I would entertain any thoughts you have on a manner of proceeding. Council has to decide its process. You've already heard my recommendation for beginning. We can either do that or we can do something alternate if the council prefers. This year, it appears to me that staff recommended numbers, which are a new concept, as I recall, actually make that process a bit easier. I think that perhaps was by design, since they were designed to fit the available resources in, because we have 1.691580 in staff recommendations that got a full funding recommendation from an outside reviewer. We have 1.893 roughly in available funds. So if we were to move those into the shopping cart, so to speak, and then work from that list, either adding to, modifying, or deleting from, it would at least give us a baseline, which I think was the purpose of the staff recommendation, if I'm not mistaken. And we'd therefore be making full use of both the work of our outside reviewers and the grants office staff.
Just a quick clarification to make sure I understand, because this is only my second time doing this meeting. General, you're talking about taking everything that's been fully recommended, that 1.691 amount, setting it aside, but then going sort of line by line through that to see if anyone has questions or concerns about what's in the full, or then would we do that for the rest of them, not the full?
My recommendation would be we do both, but with the starting that those that are in the full and the staff recommendation, they start out at the finish line. They can be removed from the finish line, or perhaps they can be overtaken by others who do not start out at the finish line. And that's what the council does. But other than that, I'm not entirely sure how we would proceed, because it's pretty random then. My guess, and I may be proven wrong on this, my guess is that there will be advocates on the council, not personal advocates, just folks that have looked at the materials and thought, for example, some applicant that's down in the partial funding really ought to be a priority. And then it would be a matter of figuring out, if that's the council's view, how we would fit it in the top group, which will require some adjustment.
And that makes sense to me if we want to start that way. I don't know if there are better ideas necessarily from others on the council, but that certainly makes sense as a way to proceed.
Are there other thoughts on the procedure from the council, or any concern or disagreement about that process? Very well, then why don't we do that by, why don't we just do it by acclamation? I don't see a reason to do that by motion since we're not taking any final action. So absent, I see no objection. Council will start with the presumption that those items in the maximum recommended column of the full category on the document titled 2021 JAG applications by reviewer and staff recommendation. In other words, those applications that have been recommended by an outside reviewer for full funding and have been recommended by the Governor's Grants Office staff for a maximum amount in a total of 1.691580 are presumably to be funded, subject to all the deliberations we're about to undertake. Is there any disagreement in that? Seeing none, we'll consider that done by unanimous consent. And I would now open it up to council discussion on any either of those items or of other items in the partially funded. I would just note a couple of things. I don't have a suggestion, certainly not a motion at this point, but I would note that two of the items that were recommended for full funding but are removed by both the action the council just took and the staff recommendation are items from agencies that typically have received substantial support from the council in this process, the Kansas Judicial Branch and the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, where a function providing services to multiple law enforcement agencies in Kansas. May or may not change what we just started with, but those are significant departures from where the council often has been in the past. And I would also note that looking at the list of local entities, including but not limited to local law enforcement agencies that are in the basket we just created, they are, for the most part, there are a couple of outliers, but for the most part, they are geographically clustered in the northeast part of the state. And while not perhaps formally a criterion, the council has in the past often looked to geographical diversity of its grant awards, and that's at least a factor I think we ought to be mindful of in terms of what decisions we make. With that, does any council member want to start us in looking at any particular item that's in and they think shouldn't be, or that's out and they think should be in, or otherwise, just a concern on the merits of any item, particularly one that's already in the basket?
Without the mask or not. In the comment that I think you're referring to that was in the larger spreadsheet about looking at the 4 higher, that was when we moved down to the partial group in order to prioritize or set some kind of a tier for considering that group. We didn't apply that same rule to the full because it felt like we were able to fund everything in the pool at the level suggested or otherwise noted. So that point, it became more of a council discussion. Did that answer the question? As far as the reviewer's recommendation to fund in full and possibly gave it a lower rating, I can't necessarily answer to what their thought process was with that. I should have thrown out earlier, though, that the reviewers were not aware of how much money necessarily was available because it wouldn't have been relevant. They needed to consider each application individually on its own merit. And since they weren't looking at all 45 or 46 applications, having that awareness of the dollars available was not part of their consideration and their recommendation.
Well, I might ask a question. I just started at the beginning, so I'm not picking on these folks. They just happen to be on the top of the list, but it's application number 5 for the Sac and Clock Nation, which is recommended in the basket. We just put our arms around for $29,000. So I'm looking at the details of that application. The application is for money to be used by the tribal police department to purchase, mount, and install laptop computers and patrol vehicles to interface with automated license plate readers and forward-looking infrared cameras. And I'm sort of struggling based on that description to see how that interfaces with any of the priority areas that the council has previously set. It's not tied to mental illness, drug enforcement, or retention, or necessarily crisis intervention, suicide, etc. And then I'm looking at the staff notes for that. And the staff notes indicate that the application is incomplete, didn't submit agency budget information. The data reported did not change from the prior year's application. It's unclear how the data that was submitted correlates to the request. A variety of other information about staffing, sustainability, et cetera, and the audit were not updated for the 2020 application. The civil rights contract information does not match the non-discrimination policy submitted in the 2020 project. Grant management capacity was not updated from the 2020 application, and the applicant didn't answer what were at least previously federally required responses and required by the policy of this council. Questions regarding their interaction with the Department of Homeland Security and ICE. I guess I'm struggling to understand. That's pretty negative to me. I mean, those are staff notes that suggest a photocopy of a prior year's application with a few scratch outs, seeking money for things outside the core mission that we've set as a council, and an incomplete application and a non-certification of what were federally mandated requirements. How on earth did they become recommended?
So as we categorize these between the full, partial, and deny, we base that solely on what the outside reviewer's recommendation was. And then we as staff took that and determined either what we think a maximum amount based on their budget requests should be if there were unallowable items, for example, or calculation errors, or based on the availability of dollars. These kinds of notes about things that were missing, we wanted to make sure the council was aware of, although oftentimes we have made those special conditions, whereas the applicant may be told you'll receive funds if you get everything in order by a certain deadline, and that's at the council's discretion as well.
So we probably need to take a pretty close look at each of these individual items to identify whether there are those types of concerns. Okay. Very good. Thank you. What?
Question on that. I think last year, if I remember, I think we had, several incomplete applications. And I'm trying to recall if we had sort of approved some of those, on the condition that if they are listed as having incomplete information in the staff comments or something, that, the grant award would be conditioned on them providing that information, sort of just as a bulk, as a general condition for all of the awards. Is that something that we have? Am I remembering that correctly? And is that a solution to some of these problems where there may be a deserving request that just hasn't gotten the paperwork part right yet?
Yes, to answer your question broadly. There were applications last year that the council elected to fund, and we did attach some special conditions to make sure that we had a complete grant application on file. And there may have been some other conditions attached based on discussion during the council meeting, which I can't recall just off the top of my head. But that is definitely a process. We definitely attach special conditions to any awards that the council makes to ensure that everything is submitted and in compliance with where it needs to be in order to ensure that we can move forward with their project.
Gotcha. And then I think the general raised another issue that was sort of less process oriented or less paperwork oriented, but was about the, whether this particular application, I suppose, fits into the substantive areas that we're trying to hit with these grants under the solicitation document. Is there something that we're missing there that maybe connects those dots a little bit better? Or I guess, and maybe for a question, Colonel Jones or Director Thompson, some of the law enforcement professionals here maybe can connect those dots a little bit better in terms of, how a new laptop in a patrol vehicle might relate to obviously drug enforcement or crisis intervention, even retention issues with officers. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to take a look at my strategy notes. As far as falling within the state strategy, as staff, we really sort of left that to the merit of the application. So the applicant should have explained how they thought that it met the state strategy. And the grant reviewers that we use, the outside reviewers, also included a lot of comments throughout. Not necessarily every application had a comment on that subject, but oftentimes they did. And so we made sure to include that in the summary of the reviewer comments. But we didn't use that to sort or the little notations that we made on the one-page summary as far as who might have had items missing from their application. We didn't make those notations in regard to the state strategy.
So Joe, I have a question. If there's not a reference to it in the reviewer's summary back to the free strategy, does that mean the application is absent?
No, not necessarily. Unfortunately, I don't have that information to be able to tell you application by application what their response was or how it fits within the strategy. Staff might be able to help me with that a little bit. But in absence of that, it is really at the discretion of the council to determine whether it fits the state strategy or whether it merits consideration based on its own content.
And Jill, I'm correct that some of the available funds we have are prior year funds, right?
Yes, that is correct. On the one-page summary where you see the requests separated by full, partial, and deny, we have a box at the top left corner. I failed to discuss that in my earlier comments, where we have laid out for you all what funds are left over or not being expended by current grantees We request all of the existing subgrantees to submit to us in July a report stating whether or not they anticipate having any funds remaining. And so we took those into consideration and sort of added them back into the pool so that we could try to really maximize the amount of dollars that we can award out.
Well, council, I think we have, let me suggest we have two paths for proceeding. There may be another, and if there is, believe me, I'm more than open to hearing it. But in an effort to move our focus along, I think path number one is we can start through just sequentially the items that we just put in the basket, take a look at them individually, determine whether we won't have to vote on them initially in or out, but get a sense of whether the council identifies concerns about their being in. For example, I just identified some that, or at least me, caused me some concern with the first one we put in. That will give us a sense then of whether there are some items we've already put in the basket that the council seems to think really do need to be there based on their individual merits, and give us a more solid base to work from. Alternative two is we can do the same thing in mirror image. We can look at the items that are out and try to identify ones we think want to be in. My guess would be it would be more efficient to look at the ones in first, because there may be some that council has a sense really don't belong in, and that will give us a clearer picture of how much head space we have in our funding pot before we have to make the hard choices, which are going to come at the end. So if there's not an alternate proposal, or if there's not concern with that, I would suggest we start going through individually those items that we've just, the 1.691580 items, and just get a sense on each of them, not a detailed deep dive unless some council member wants to, but a sense of whether there seems to be a consensus that yes, that belongs in the funded group, or there really are issues we need to take a look at before we get done. Is that agreeable to? All right. Well, then let's start with the one we just started with. I'm not sure a lot more time is necessary on that, unless some of the council member wants to talk about it. I would say it gives me some concern, the items that I just mentioned. And I have perhaps a, if not unique, at least a disproportionately focused concern on the DHS information, because as Attorney General, I've had to certify to the Department of Justice that none of these grant funds will go to certain jurisdictions that are not in compliance with various provisions of federal law. And I, of course, intend to live up to that certification. So that, for me at least, is a significant red flag. Although I'd be quick to acknowledge, to Clay's point, perhaps it could be cured for an individual applicant that we otherwise favor on the back end. So I'm not suggesting it's a bright line disqualifier. It's just a very red flag for me for that reason. And I at least also would have questions about how tightly that project, while no doubt meritorious, fits within the priorities that the council has set previously. So anything else need to be said at this point about that one? When we take a look at the next one, which is the Andover Police Department's application number 6. Actually, let me back up to number 5. Perhaps as we go through this, it would be more efficient. I don't know, this may be inapplicable to a tribal department. I don't know the rules, but Director, are they required to be in compliance with data submission? And if so, is this particular applicant?
They are. There's only one application prior to that is not the application.
Okay. Got it. Thank you. I will not ask you that every time now that you've let us know that. Very good. Let's look at application number 6. Does appear to be. Turn on your mic so that it can, so. Herman can hear you and others. Well, KBI didn't get funded, and apparently your mic doesn't work either, so.
There we go. I'll shorten up my statement considerably and say that I believe that that application meets clearly one of the strategic plan areas, and given the rating by both staff and the outside reviewer, I think it fits clearly.
Anybody have any further comments? It does look squarely in, so it looks like that might be a green one. That is to say, it probably belongs in there. I would note the staff note that the application was incomplete, and I assume that if we were to award it, the staff would require as a condition of receiving funds that any necessary information be properly submitted.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Very good. Next one is item number 7. Narcotics analyzer.
Mr. Chairman, for the benefit of the group, if I could, it appears that this is to acquire what's called Raman technology. It's a new type of field testing device for drug enforcement. It is rather expensive technology, as you can see, but it seemed to fit within the priority area number 2, drug enforcement.
Is this roadside? Is this roadside testing?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to mark that one currently as a green. Next one that's in the approved list, we'll skip over number 8 because it was not on that already approved list, is number 9. It's also a substance abuse application. It would appear to me on its face to be within the priority areas established by the council. Received very favorable remarks from the grant reviewer and no particular concerns. I would characterize them as minor concerns that could be cured on the back end in staff comments. Is that an accurate description? That also a green item? Very well. And
Just-
also add some geographical diversity.
Oh, that's what I was just going to say. It helps with that concern as well. And I think it's also good to note that, this is a repeat application. It sounds like it's been a good steward of these funds in the past as well.
Agreed. Excellent. Next one is item number 11, which is the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. By the way, number 9 we just covered was Northwest Kansas Community Corrections. Item number 11, Jackson County Sheriff's Office. In-car computers, crime scene mapping, replace obsolete equipment. Looks like the crime scene mapping tech is new.
Just, Mr. Chairman, I wonder if this might be a good point in time to discuss whether or not technology enhancements in general are really covered under the funding priorities for drug enforcement workforce retention and hiring or crisis intervention. That may simplify a lot of our concerns as we go through this, because I do recall that there are a number of applications that are for technology that may not, at least from the application summaries, we're not seeing the connection to drug enforcement or some of the other priority areas.
Very well. What's the council think about that threshold question?
Sorry. I wonder, I mean, it is sort of hard because everything can be either improved or undermined, I guess, by good or bad technology. And so I guess I'm looking for some direction from Colonel Jones and Director Thompson on sort of what your views are, and General Schmidt, what your views are on, is that an effective sort of way of getting at these three strategic objectives? I can see for sure, as someone who uses technology on a daily basis, if you give me an old junky computer that doesn't work, maybe I am more likely to want to find a different job. So I can certainly see a connection there to retention. And if we're talking about crisis intervention or having the ability to get information quickly in a crisis situation or during a traffic stop for drug interdiction purposes, maybe there is a strong connection between these technology upgrades and our sort of three strategic areas of concern. But I would definitely look to the law enforcement folks on our council for some guidance on how to think about those things.
Colonel or Director, you want to offer any thoughts on that subject matter?
Yeah, Ken, this is Colonel Jones here. I was just trying to, as we're going through that, I'm looking at our listing of what it would take for to follow into the strategic plan and looking at mental health, law enforcement, and prevention of education. So I kind of zero in on those, what is actually on the face of the application and what we have from the instructions here. Again, to what Clay has said, we could probably stretch that, but if we go by the face of what the application says, I'm finding a little more difficulty in the law enforcement for crisis intervention, particularly mental health, drug enforcement. I guess maybe if this enhancement of the computers are pertaining to drug enforcement, it looks like the equipment's obsolete. They're doing some crime scene type of enhancement investigations for that right there, but and maybe workforce hire and retain of qualified staff. I'm not seeing how the equipment that you get, if that's going to enhance or retain individual staff. So I'm trying to find the correlation of what the instructions are and what the application is. I think any type of enhancement you have for computers is going to help you one kind of way, one sort of way, but attaching it to what our instructions are, I'm trying to get a correlation. I'm struggling a little bit with that.
And another thought I have, I mean, technology and treating it as potentially, or technology improvements, treating them as potentially going to one of these three subject areas also just sort of risks any request for any technology improvements is always it's probably always going to connect in some way to some of those priorities. And so I'm not sure how much, how useful it is, I think, to distinguish between applications if we're going to say, well, a new laptop certainly helps you do all of these things. Well, it's probably going to help you do almost everything. That's not sort of a physical activity you need to do out in the field as a law enforcement officer or dealing with, somebody in a community corrections context or a mental health context. So I guess it's difficult. And I think I would probably, seems like maybe when the request is for a technological improvement of some kind or equipment on the tech side, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not worthy of funds in this process, but maybe it is not quite the green, you pass go, collect your $200 situation, and it's something we want to put into yellow bucket at this point, or think about once we get some of these other items on the list that we think, well, actually would like to up that partial amount or give them some partial funding, that we could look to some of these technology requests as a place to sort of grab some dollars if we need to. I think that would make some sense going forward.
I agree. I think that's an excellent point, and I don't mean to stifle discussion, but it seems to me the sense of the council at this point is this is a presumably meritorious application. The question is where it fits in the overall priorities, because it's perhaps not right on point, but could be shoehorned in with the priorities. So I've marked it as a yellow for right now, and we'll come back to it. Let's look at number 16, which is the application of the Westwood Police Department for radios. I suppose it would fit in almost exactly the same grouping of what we just saw. So I'll mark it similarly, and we'll look at it in the broader context. All right, let's look at item number 17, which is the Brothers in Blue reentry program. I don't recall what we did last year, but prior to that, Brothers in Blue had been funded by this council through these grants for many years. I don't know how many, but it was many years. And I can recall a time or two that it was perhaps not in the first basket of priorities, and the council at that time elected to move it in. So it has historically had strong support on the council. Council have any thoughts on this one? I would say it certainly fits the priorities overall. The type of reentry support it provides is designed to squarely assist reentering offenders with those and other types of support.
I would agree.
Please, yes.
I would simply echo what you said and also note that their application seems to be clear and robust, supporting the priorities, and they have been a fairly good steward of these funds in the past. So I think they are soundly within the basket.
Very good. Will there be any concern if I mark this one green? We'll mark it green. The blue is green. Item number 19. Which is the 5th Judicial District Community Corrections application. It's a drug testing substance abuse application. So on its face, it does appear to fit within the priority areas.
Can I ask a quick
Please.
question about the outside reviewer or the grant reviewer process? On some of these where we've had repeats over the years, is there any system by which we're sort of subbing in a new grant reviewer to do that review every year? Or is it potentially the same person who reviews this 5th Judicial District application every year? Or how is that working, if we know?
Yeah. It's not a straight yes, it's always the same, or no, it's never the same, because it depends a little bit on availability. But we do have certain reviewers that we reach out to. And in particular with JAG, for example, we try to find someone with a lot of background in law enforcement to look at the law enforcement related requests and so on. So the reviewers that we utilized, I don't think any of them were first-time reviewers, but I can't say for certain if all of them looked at just last year, for example.
Gotcha. And I guess the reason I'm asking is just to know whether, I think I remember this one from last year, and I think if I remember correctly, it was sort of well reviewed by the outside reviewer last year as well. Just kind of wondering if this is now 2 different people who've done that outside review and both agreed that they did put together a really good application, or if it's the same person. either way, I'm sure it's a great application, but I'm just kind of interested in that process as we would go forward. Thank you.
Absent any further discussion, it sounds to me like the 5th Judicial District Community Corrections application is agreed. Let's move on to number 22, which is the Marysville Police Department, upgrading body cams, replacing obsolete body cams and car-mounted cams, and a server.
Chairman, I note in the application that they, in their, I think it's their executive summary, they tie it back to all three legs of the strategic plan.
Perhaps for our purposes right now, it would be fair to mark it as a yellow in the tech basket only because of that broader policy issue. But I would tend to agree with you. This one in particular seems to connect well to the purposes. Agreeable. I'll do the same. Number 28, which is the Pratt Police Department. Appears to be squarely on point with drug enforcement. It would, on its face, strike me as on all fours with what we've been looking at and suitable for a green mark at this point, unless somebody sees it differently. Number 30, the 28th Judicial District Community Corrections. Also, drug enforcement and addiction and behavioral health. They've got all three. The reviewers identified no weaknesses and gave them a 25 out of 25.
Seems solid.
That is gold star material right there.
I guess I will just note, this seems like another one of those that has, incomplete application issues that I would think we would want to just condition, receipt of that on providing that additional information, assuming that it can be provided, I suppose.
Agreed. And with respect to my specific concern articulated, it looks like there's a wrinkle with their Homeland Security data, but it does not appear from this summary that the problem is they don't have the data. It's the format in which they submitted it. So we'd certainly want the proper format. I will make it green. Number 31, Western Kansas Child Advocacy Center. This is also one that has for many years been funded by this council. And appears to be squarely within our areas of priority. Serves 34 counties, strikes me as a green mark. Next one is number 38, the Kansas CASA Association. Also 25 out of 25 from the reviewers, but significant notes, it appears, staff notes. So it appears to me there are a couple of things at work here, Jill, or somebody tell me if I'm misstating or misunderstanding. It appears that the $34,420 recommended amount that we have, I'll say tentatively approved, placed into the basket, the adjustment is downward roughly $3,000, a little less from the request. And that the reason for that is the vehicle dollars, right? The repair vehicle dollars that are described in the staff notes.
That is a significant portion. And we did note all the budget changes that resulted in that amount. There was also just an issue with how they proportioned out the amount of time to be spent on the project. So we made adjustments to ensure that that is all in line across all line items.
And then, of course, this one, like others, if we approve it, would be subject to the remaining I's dotted and T's crossed, right?
Correct.
Strikes me as a green item unless there's a different view or concern. Clay?
Just had a quick question on this one. So going back, Jill, to your discussion at the beginning of the pass-through funds, which I think you said are 66% of what we're supposed to be approving. So these particular funds would not be eligible for that pass-through because this is a statewide expense. So any of these $34,000 or whatever are coming out of the 34% of the bucket of the funding bucket that we have. Am I thinking about that correctly?
You're thinking about it correctly. It's actually a smaller bucket. I refer to it as discretionary. What's left over after we meet the other two thresholds. Can you understand me when my mask is on? All right, good. The 66% is a variable pass-through, and then we also have the amount that we have to award to the local jurisdictions not eligible to get direct funding, and that's around another 15 or 16%. So the amount of true discretionary dollars is closer to about 18. I mean, depends on the year that we're pulling funding from, but that's more, a generality. This project, though, you are correct, because it's a statewide project, you'd have to get a waiver letter from every county in the state, so it's not practicable. So this and Brothers in Blue would be another example that would absolutely have to be funded out of those discretionary dollars.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Green for now? Very good. Next item is item number 39, ks.gov. Focusing on support for incarcerated rape victims. Very strong 25 out of 25 recommendation. Appears there were some minor application issues noted, all of which can be cured on the back end, I believe. I think it fits. Agreed. We'll mark that as a green as well. Item number 40. Department of Corrections. Mr. Secretary, do you want to say anything about this? Do you want to describe it, or do you want me to mumble on about it?
I'm going to abstain.
Then I'll describe it. Looks like a splendid project. It's also a 25 out of 25. It's crime victim support, which almost certainly fits into the priority areas, particularly number 3. Priority number 3. I would note that the request was for $244,000 roughly, and the staff recommendation, which we have tentatively adopted, placed in the checkout basket, is for about $186,000. Jill, do you want to address that or have your team address that?
Yes, I can address that. This and other projects that fell in that discretionary category that we were just describing, we knew that there weren't enough dollars to fund everything. So what we did was we looked at those that had positions that had already been funded in the previous year with JAG, with an effort to sustain those FTEs. And so that's what we looked at. The difference then between what was requested and what was recommended is a new position and an increase to some part-time hours.
So the staff recommendation is basically flat funding as opposed to an enhancement. Is that
Correct.
their
Correct. I
request
think
for
we
an
left,
enhancement?
like,
The
pay
staff recommendation
raises
was
in there, but what we could do to make sure that FTEs were sustained.
Ms. Secretary, I recognize and appreciate and agree with your decision to recuse, but that doesn't mean you can't answer questions, as any applicant could if we had them. Does the reduced amount, if it were awarded, does it function for you? Sometimes we change numbers here and the recipient tells us it changes their game plan. So
Well, Mr. Chairman, we just wouldn't be able to deliver the services as robustly as we'd like to, but we'd be able to do the program.
green. We'll mark that one as green as well. Thank you. Item number 41, also the Department of Corrections. So on the parole side, transitional housing in Wichita. Certainly fits within the priority areas. (23 out of 25 from the reviewer. Once again, there's a recommended downward adjustment. Jill, is that for the same reasons or is there a different reason here? Same reason. So the tentatively approved amount of 67,000 and change is continue current funding levels as opposed to the enhancement that was requested. Also agree? Very well. Also agree. Item number 43, the Oxford Police Department. Radios and vests. Replace, and cameras. All three replace current obsolete equipment. Procurement only. Officer safety. Fairly low score from the reviewers, 11 out of 30. Reviewer.
Chairman, I would also note that it's designated as being significantly incomplete in this patient.
It's the first one of those designations we've seen, isn't it? As opposed to minor.
Chair, I do have a question
Please.
for staff on this one. The reviewer notes that you did receive documents later by email. Does that mean that the entire application is now complete, or are there still missing components from this application?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I couldn't hear you.
Certainly. Your reviewer notes indicate that the agency did not submit required attachments in the initial application, but required documents were submitted at a later date by email. Does that mean that right now the application is complete? And if so, were they all submitted prior to the deadline?
We reached out to this agency because their application was incomplete and also because they submitted I think 3 weeks prior to the deadline. So we did contact them and let them know that they had an opportunity to get everything in. And everything has been submitted by the deadline that we gave them. And it was all provided in the packet that was provided to the council as we received it by email later. So And that was the other reason, also the reason for the dollar amount. If you noticed, it was in red because they put it in their budget the individual cost of a single unit of what they would like to purchase rather than by quantity. So we adjusted that.
And a follow-up question, when you adjusted that, did you adjust it and receive confirmation from them that that's the correct dollar amount? Or was-
Yes.
okay, yes.
Council, is this yellow take another look, or is this a green? Sort of gathering it might be yellow take another look, although I understand that some of the problems identified have been cured. I'm going to identify it as yellow. We'll take another look as we look at other items. Next item is number 44, Avenue of Life. It's a reentry program. Trauma-informed and reduce recidivism. It suggests that it fits within our priorities. Solid score, 23 to 25 from the reviewer. And I would note in the staff notes, if I'm understanding them correctly, there is a waiver from unified government. So it could be funded out of the local pot, pass-through pot, if when we get to number crunching at the end, that's necessary. Looks to me like a green item unless others see it differently. And finally, in this first tranche, item number 45, the Edwardsville Police Department. Another in-car laptops and LPRs. Okay. That strikes me on its face like another yellow technology item for that same basket. Very well, committee. That gets us through our first run through on the previously tentatively approved group. I might suggest here since we did identify a number of those as green, we'd already tentatively approved them, and upon looking at them, they appear to us to be probables. Perhaps we ought to see if the team would tally up the greens and see where our actual number is, assuming we were to approve the greens. That'll give us a better sense of how far off of our available funding we in fact are. My notes indicate, tell me if anybody has it differently. The items we marked as green and therefore that should be added together and give us a total, a running total are number 6, number 7, number 9, number 17, number 19, number 28, number 30, number 31, number 38, number 39, number 40, number 41, number 44. Can you do your magic?
Okay. So of those applications that the council has indicated as green, the sum is 1,370,141. Those that were marked with your term in the yellow pool are all requests that fall under the local variable pass-through, but also the amount that we have to fund to those entities that could not apply directly to the Department of Justice. So I'm only saying that because as you decide whether to include them back in, they pretty much all fall within that same silo.
In other words, it would be very difficult to take funds that might be freed up if those non-greens were not funded and use them for example, state level program. We'd really need to use them for a different type of local program to satisfy the different categories.
Yes.
Makes some
correct.
sense. Yep. Okay. Well, committee, this is, I don't think we're at a voting point yet, but I want to get a sense of whether the council is generally comfortable. I mean, based on what we've done so far, it looks like we have tentatively agreed, that about 1.3 million, we have a pretty good sense of where we want it to go, which would leave about 500,000 remaining. Obviously, that may change yet as we look at others and have to make trade-offs. Council makes decisions on the relative priority of different ones, but I just want to get a sense if we're pretty comfortable that that's our pretty solid base that we're starting from. Very good, and it appears to be. So that then raises the question of how to proceed next. Again, I think we have a couple of choices. We can either sort of sequentially walk through the next category, which are the partial funds. I don't really see a purpose unless some council member feels to the contrary to focus on the deny recommendations. We can start through the partials. We can start through the partials, starting with those that staff has recommended, which is only 3. Or, and when I say partials, by the way, I would include for our purposes here, I think there were 3 items in the fulls that didn't get a staff recommendation. I think we ought to treat them as partials for purpose of council consideration. That would be the judicial branch, the KBI, and the Douglas County CASA. No, strike that. The Douglas County CASA. So I think I'd take a sense of where any council member might want to go. If there is no sense, we will just sequentially march through this next group. But I'll spare you that if there's a strong feeling of picking a few out of focus. Secretary?
Mr. Chairman, I'd recommend that we start with the partials that we recommended by the staff and then move down the list from there.
Very good. Agreeable? Let's do that. Why don't we do the partials recommended by the staff, follow that with the 3 that received full recommendations from the outside reviewers, but not a staff recommendation. Get those on the table, dispose of them one way or the other, then see where that leaves us. That seem reasonable? Very well. All right, that being the case, let's take a look at number 14, which is the One Heart Project. This received a partial recommendation from the outside reviewers and a recommendation for partial funding from the staff review. Focused on at-risk youth. (13 out of 25 is the reviewer's score. Okay. Anybody have any thoughts on that one? I guess I might ask Jill. I'm sorry to do that, but there was a recommendation of substantial reduction from the request. You want to describe what that is? From 233,000 down to 69,000.
Yes. And also, I got a note that there are some folks that are listening online that are not always able to hear. So just want to remind, I learned this. You got to pretty much be up to the mic in order for it to pick you up. On the One Heart Project, as you can see, the grant reviewer gave it mediocre scores, only about 50% on the rating, and a middle number of 3 on the ranking. So we did take that into consideration as we were making our recommendation. The reviewer did not specify certain things that they thought should or should not be funded. So we took a look at the overall budget and also the consideration of what our staff, as they familiarize themselves with the project during a compliance review, there were positions that were working very directly full-time with the youth. And so that was the position that we really focused on when we were coming up with that partial recommendation.
Can I ask a technical question? The one sheeter we're working from indicates that the rank was 5 out of 5, but I think that the more detailed showing shows a 3 out of 5. Am I reading that correctly, or is there an error?
The 5 out of 5 is a typo.
Okay, so it is a 3 out of 5, not a 5 out of 5.
Yes,
Got it.
that is correct.
Very good. Clay, did you have something? Okay. Mr. Secretary?
Jill, this looks like not only not funding the request for this year, but a substantial reduction from their funding last year.
Yes.
Can you speak just a little bit more to that and why that recommendation is being made?
Really, it's comes down to the 2 things that I already mentioned, which is that the outside reviewer really recommended a partial funding and not full consideration. And so when we looked at that, we looked at the positions that were working directly with the youth. There are other positions that were in the project, a director, and Jocelyn, you're going to have to help me. Some contractual hours that they utilized with last year's funding. And so that's the difference between the request amount and the recommended amount.
And Jill, I don't know if you, so did the reviewer not feel like those positions were contributing enough to be included in the grant, the work that was being done by those positions, or do you know?
Well, the reviewer, I don't want to put words in their mouths, but from the comments, I just got the sense that they didn't feel like the application warranted full funding. So their recommendation was partial. They did not go the next step to say, these are the specific line items that I think should be funded and the specific line items that I don't. And so that's where we just tried to come up with the best recommendation based on the information that we had.
Thank you.
And a quick question. Is this one where we ought to be concerned in any way about, I understand, I think this decrease in funding from last year is to sort of acknowledge that the program director was the one staff providing direct services for the project, and that we're trying to sort of fund that program director position. Is the existence of that program director position sort of contingent on those other positions around the program director that the other funds would have paid for? Sort of getting at, I think, the general's comment earlier that sometimes if we decrease something and then that's actually not workable in real life because they needed the additional funds in order to have a program director in the first place or something like that. Do we have any sense with this one, whether that's something we should be concerned about here?
I don't have a very good sense to be able to answer that with any great deal of confidence. I know that the program, when the council began funding it with these JAG dollars, it was new. And so they've been slowly growing over the last few years. But I don't know what their overall budget and other sources of revenue looks like right now.
And procedurally, if we were to say, okay, $69,000 instead of the 200 plus that you recommended, if for some reason they just can't make that work, the money doesn't get spent, it goes back into the bucket and we deal with it again next year, correct?
Yes, either that or we do allow subgrantees to submit budget revisions during the course of their grant year. So if the agency were to ask to move some of those funds somewhere and it did not change the scope of the project the way the council approved it, we might consider that.
Okay. Thank you.
Give them some latitude.
Council, we're only at this moment talking about a universe of 6. So before I start writing letters, why don't we just look at the other 5 and then we'll figure out how we want to deal with those. Next item is number 23, Miami County Sheriff's Office. Special Operations Response Team focused on drug enforcement. It does appear to fit the priority number 2. It's equipment. Did receive a 25 out of 30, which appears to be a different scale than the out of 25s that we've been looking at. Staff recommendation is reduced by roughly half, and the notes appear to suggest that in the absence of guidance in the application on how to reduce, the approach was to reduce by focusing funding on body cameras and evidence storage, which would appear to get us back into our technology discussion that we were having earlier. Okay, anything else we need on that at this moment? No? Let's look at the next one, which is item number 26, the Coffeyville Police Department. On the out of 30. A little hard to discern from the summary here what the exact request is. And this is one where the staff recommendation is for full funding based on an assessment that the project could not be completed with partial funding. So consistent with the discussion we've been having in others, the assessment appears to be an all or nothing approach on this one. What it's not entirely clear to me, and I don't have in front of me the actual application. It's not clear to me from this what they're asking for. Perhaps I'm just missing it, but what do they want to use this money for other than equipment?
I'm going off the top of my head as well, but I know that a portion of the project had to do with getting a tower in a certain location so that the departments in the area would all be able to talk to each other. As far as the right project here. Yeah, okay. And that was the rationale for our comment, that it appeared to be an all or nothing. There may be members of the council who understand what goes into reaching that goal better than we do, but just based on the information provided in the application, that was certainly the sense that we got.
Okay. Anybody seek more information at this point? All right, let's go ahead and take a look at those three from the full category that have not been included in our recommendations. Number 8 is Douglas County CASA. They want to hire somebody to recruit and train more volunteers. What CASA does. Serve more kids. Staff review appears that there's some concern about supplanting. Is that a fair read of that? And then, of course, no local jurisdiction waivers, so it would have to be funded out of discretionary dollars, which are at a premium. Are you able, well, I don't want to put you on the spot, Jill or team, but this is the first one we've seen where supplanting's, obviously it's always an issue, but it's the first we've seen where it's articulated as a concern in the staff comments. Was there something in particular about this application that raised a supplanting concern?
The supplanting concern on this one is that the applicant not only wanted to create a new position, but they wanted to reassign a portion of the, I think it was the director's time to the project as well. So it was just that piece of the existing position, the director, if I recall the right title, being put on this grant that was our concern. The new position obviously would not be a supplanting concern because it's new. That circles back to my earlier statements that we looked on the discretionary requests at those that had FTEs currently on the JAG grant with our goal to try and sustain those.
Got it. Okay. Anything else on that one at this point?
Yeah, with the local jurisdiction waivers, is that something that, I'm trying to remember how we did some of these last year, where we could sort of conditionally approve subject to them getting that waiver, or is it just beyond, they had to do it before and they can't sort of cure that issue at this point? Is there any flexibility there?
I would say that would be a discussion and decision for the council. As far as in the past, the only times that I can recall where we allowed an applicant to go back, so to speak, is if they had a multi-county service area and they had some waivers, but not all. And so we were looking at somehow proportioning out what we could count as that local pass-through. But in this case, it's Douglas County and they didn't include anything.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Let's take a look at number 37, which was also one that was recommended full, but not in the staff recommendation that we tentatively adopted. It's KBI funding for a machine with a really long name. Might ask a factual question of the director. Is this part of the, is this driven in part by the policy decisions the legislature and the federal government have made to move us into the hemp and marijuana business?
That's correct. This equipment would allow for the testing of, quantified testing of hemp, THC in hemp. It also provides some access to testing for fentanyl, some of the other synthetic cannabinoid compounds. There is one device that was approved by the legislature, and that device is in Topeka. I understand there was some concern about or question about where these devices would go. There are two separate grant applications out there. One is through JAG and one is through Coverdale. And those would go to different locations, one in western Kansas and one in southeastern Kansas. So there is a duplicate application, but for a different location. That would allow us to service all of the 400 plus law enforcement agencies. The number of tests anticipated is somewhere around 6,000. And that's based upon prior submissions to the laboratory system. The other thing that's kind of a wild card here is neither Sedgwick County nor Johnson County laboratories are planning on going this route to be able to quantitate the amount of THC or THC acid in any of these substances. So we will be doing some additional ones, so we just don't have an idea of what that universe is right now. So I hope that answers the questions that you had, other than the DHS information. It was in legal review at the time it was due, and apparently we did not submit it.
Could I ask you, Director, I have watched from across the street as you've had discussions over here with our policymakers on this, and I've been very happy to be across the street. But were there any discussions or representations made during legislative deliberations on any hemp or related legislation that as to how, I mean, I know you told them if you do this, we got to have new equipment in order to be able to help law enforcement agencies differentiate between something below 0.03 and something above. But I'm just trying to ascertain whether there's any reliance expectation that on this or not.
From the perspective of maintaining our caseload, maintaining, avoiding developing large backlogs, we believe, based upon the numbers that we were using for our estimates, that we would need up to 6 employees to do this, and at least 3 of these devices in various laboratories around the state to support what we believe would be the case load coming in from local partners. But beyond creating the very basic capacity, the base capacity of being able to test hemp for the presence of THC at quantity levels that could be identified, this is base level what the legislature gave us. Anything else that we're going to do to improve service levels to our local partners will have to come from another source, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I don't mean to press it. I mean, it's one thing, you know, we got to make a decision based on what we got here. We don't really have a choice, and we got a lot of good priorities. It's one thing, with all respect, to disappoint the KBI and say, we can't afford this. It's quite another thing if the KBI represented to perhaps bipartisan legislative leaders or appropriators during the policy discussion, if you do this, we need 3 machines, and we're told we're funding 1, go get grant funding for 2. Then we are disappointing somebody other than the KBI director, which we may need to do. I'm trying to understand whether that reliance was created or not.
I have no recollection that there was that type of go find money somewhere else type of.
Okay. Council, anything else we want to ascertain on that one? And then the last one in this category is the judicial branch, number 42. Centralized and standardized data collection, sustain current drug court programs, and pilot new standardized drug courts. So it would appear on its face to fit within the priorities. High score, 24 out of 25 from the outside reviewer. Not sure I quite understand those first two sentences of the staff notes. Payroll taxes and benefits requested as lump sum. Oh, they wanted money in order to pay those things for new employees. Got it. Is there anything you want to provide us with on information on this one?
But certainly I would need to abstain on decision-making, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that the community may have on the special report initiative. There are 14 in existence. I'm sorry, 14 in existence in 12 judicial districts. So part of it is an ongoing effort, but part of it is to try to make some additional effort to stand up newer courts and to improve the services offered by those existing courts.
Is it all focused on drug courts or other specialty courts as well?
There are other specialty courts as well. 9 of the 14 are drug courts, but there are also, I believe, 2 truancy courts, veterans treatment court, and perhaps 2 mental health courts as well. I can double check the numbers, but more drugs than any, but there are several others.
And you want to share any information on more precisely what the money is, if it were available, would be used for? Obviously, some of it is people based on the payroll taxes and benefits.
Correct. There are several personnel positions, or there are a couple personnel positions to add the oversight of these programs. There are also, one of them is a data collection position. So that's a new position not currently in existence to evaluate the efficacy of these treatment courts. We don't really have a good way to evaluate metrics right now. The other piece is a lot of safety improvements that have needed to be made or will need to be made in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And some of those upgrades that are necessary from that are going to be the other piece of the money.
Okay. Any other information desired on that?
Thank you.
I just have a question for staff on this one. A subgrantee cannot subgrant funds. So is the idea that here, we would be appropriating money to the judicial branch sort of on a statewide basis, and then the judicial branch would be making some decisions about which counties might get money to set up their own drug court or veterans court or whatever, and that is part of the issue, that sort of procedural problem?
Yes, and the application had a line item for passing funds through to those local courts, and that is an expense we cannot fund. The courts would need to apply directly if they wanted to be considered for JAG dollars. And so that, regardless of the council's decision, that would definitely be one line item that we would have to remove.
I guess I'm going to make sure I understand though. So not all of the 368,000 that was requested would be sort of these pass through to local drug court programs or specialty court programs. Some of it would be, and that would not be allowed, but the remainder would be sort of more general sort of administrative support stuff that they would do on a state level at the judicial branch.
I don't believe that any of the project would be considered pass-through to locals because the funding that would be allowable for this application would be at the state level.
Yeah, sorry, I used the wrong, I shouldn't have used that term, but I guess a chunk of this, there's a line item that says we'll send money to local specialty courts as we either see fit or, in this amount or something. That piece would not be allowed under the rules. Correct. But there would be an other chunk of money that would be spent sort of at the state level that would be allowed.
Correct.
Do we have a sense of what those numbers are?
To use the same terminology that's on your sheet, the maximum recommendation that we had noted was 211,508. And so that makes that adjustment based on the staff comments.
Gotcha. No, not for me.
Council, I have one further procedural thought here as I've had a chance to look a little more carefully at the complete list. We now have the group of greens that we have tentatively approved, subject to adjustment. Then we have the group of partials that were staff recommended and the group of fulls that were not staff recommended. There's a total of 6, 3 of each of those that we sort of put on the table here to figure out how we want to fill the remaining pot. As I look at the balance of the list, there are 3 and only 3 partials that received a 4 out of 5 recommendation from the reviewers, which I thought I understood Jill to mention was one of the things that they sort of looked at as they were doing staff assessments of the partials, but that we have not already looked at. And that would be the Bourbon County Sheriff's Office application, the City of Valley Center Police Department, and the City of Wichita Police Department. So if we were, for example, to take individual looks at those 3, we would then have taken individual looks at all of the partials at 4 out of 5, including but not limited to those that received a staff recommendation. There would be a total of 6 of those. And then we also would have looked at the 3 full recommendations that were not staff recommended. There would be 3 of those. That would be a universe of 9. And it would seem that might be both a logical cutoff point in terms of the universe we're going to look at given the available funds. Unless some council member feels to the contrary, I'm skeptical we're going to get to those 2 of 5 or 3 of 5s that were not staff recommended. We just don't have enough money. So perhaps we ought to go look at those other 3, 4 or 5s individually, and then we have the entire universe in front of us and we can start sorting out how to do that. Does that seem reasonable and agreeable? All right. That being the case, let's look at number 4. That is was recommended for partial funding. That's the Bourbon County Sheriff's Office request. Appears to be drug enforcement. Appears to be a manpower grant. They want a body to assist with drug enforcement. Task force that was in the area operating is no longer active, so they're trying to fill a vacuum, it appears. (26 out of 30) is the recommendation. Is this for 2? How many positions were they asking for, Jill? Was it for 2?
Yes, 2.
And they indicate that 1 would be fine with them too. 1 position would make a good dent.
That was the
That's a
outside
reviewer's
reviewer
comment.
comment.
Got it. App was incomplete. And one of the incomplete items is, as I've already suggested, particularly important to me, the DHS data was not provided. So that's potentially fatal. Seems to fit within the priorities, but does have significant shortcomings. Is that their assessment? All right, let's go ahead and take a look at number 32, which is the City of Valley Center Police Department. They want to hire a full-time advocate, support victims of crime and mental illness. (19 of 25). got a mechanical problem with how they uploaded their DHS info, but it looks like they did upload it. They just didn't do it right. So that's curable, perhaps. They have a potential supplanting concern if they don't backfill. It looks like they want to hire from within for the new position. It does appear to be within the priority areas. Anything else on that one?
Can I ask what, you probably mentioned this before, Jill, but the risk assessments, low, moderate, high, I assume maybe isn't here. There's just a note in the staff review that of all partial recommendations with the 4 or higher ranking, this request is a moderate risk. What's that? What risk are we talking about?
That is in reference to the risk assessment, the internal document that we use when we're reviewing applications. It's a low, moderate, or high ranking or scale, so to speak. And it's based on a criteria, how complete the application is, how clear the information was. A lot of information that the applicants provide to us in one of the attachments called the grant management capacity. So things like their internal controls and their accounting system, experience of staff, that kind of thing.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Any other info desired on that one? Okay, and then the last one in our category is number 33, which is the City of Wichita Police Department request application. Outreach, gap bridging with the African American and Hispanic community is the objective. Six of 30. Doesn't seem to be any negative assessment. It's a funds available analysis and an observation that the agency, because of its relatively large size, is eligible to apply directly for JAG funding and wouldn't have to come through state allocation that the council oversees. Any questions on that? More information desired? All right. Well, council, I think this is where we're at. We have, my grammar teacher would hate that construction. This is where we are, not where we are at. We have tentatively greenlighted $1.37 million. We have roughly $500,000 available, obviously subject to adjustment. We don't have to spend everything, and we also could alter something that's already tentatively approved. In filling that remaining bucket, we have 9 applicants that we have taken individual looks at, 6 from the partial funding category, of which 3 received a staff recommendation and 3 did not. And then 3 others from the full funding category that did not receive a staff recommendation. That was Douglas County CASA, KBI, and the judicial branch. The 6 in the partial were the Bourbon County Sheriff's Office, the One Heart Project, Miami County Sheriff's Office, Coffeyville Police Department, Valley Center Police Department, and City of Wichita PD. In addition to those, we still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that we previously marked, actually, well, 5 that we previously marked yellow as technology issues from the full category. Those would be the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, the Westwood Police Department, the Marysville Police Department, and the Edwardsville Police Department. All of those we looked at and acknowledged at the time they were asking for funds to acquire technology, and we had a policy choice we wished to make with respect to that. And then we had 2 others that I'd marked as yellow that weren't technology based. They were in the full bucket. One was the Sac and Fox Nation application that we talked about, and the other was the Oxford Police Department application. So I think that's our universe of potentials that are competing for the remaining space. I suppose we have a couple of options here. One is we can attempt to address as a policy matter, at least for today's purposes, whether we want to fund, whether we're willing to fund tech acquisitions or not. Obviously, if we are, then that doesn't really tell us who gets into the final queue, but if we're not, it tells us who doesn't and shrinks the universe. Or we could not address that policy issue and we could simply look at this group of applicants sort of one by one, presumably by motion, and see how we want to go from there. My recollection is that Jill counseled us that the bulk of the remaining available funds would need to come. We pretty much spent the discretionary money, or we're pretty close to having spent the discretionary money. So it would need to come through entities that are eligible for the pass-through funds, unless the entity were able to get an appropriate waiver. Is that correct? Kind of, sort of. Okay. So that's where we are, committee. I guess my question is, what's your pleasure? Do you want to try to tackle the technology policy issue as a threshold matter? Or do we not want to try to tackle that and instead just look at individuals? And if we look at individuals, then I'm going to open it up for motions from the floor on who to add. We'll see how that goes. This is the messy part, but I don't know how else to do it. It's materially less messy because we already have 1.3 million preliminarily committed. But
Yeah, just I think it would be helpful, at least in the way I'm thinking about it, to, if we have actual numbers on what's left in discretionary, if any, and then sort of what is remaining. For instance, I think a lot of the technology pieces are probably eligible for those local pass-through dollars. Can we get some numbers at this point, having allocated? I feel like maybe last year we took a break around this time and we came back and we had some numbers and we knew that this bucket, was this big and that bucket's that small. I don't know if we are able to do that this year or not. But.
Well, I'll tell you one difference between last year and this year is that I already incorporated the numbers from this sheet that were part of the recommendation list into what we have available, and the about 10 different silos when you think about the thresholds that we need to meet and the open federal awards that we're pulling from. So to give you a straight number is very difficult until we get a little bit closer than where we are now. But what I can tell you is that because those that are in that preliminary 1.37 million include all of those that were part of the discretionary, that is pretty much eaten up. We actually, the way I have it, we're going to use just a little bit of our administrative dollars, I think, to fill some gaps in order to ensure that what is on this recommendation list are things that could be funded if the council chose to do so. So any other projects that would meet that discretionary area, if the council wanted to consider them, there would have to be something decreased or removed in order to make that consideration.
Gotcha. So just thinking about some specific ones, KBI, judicial branch, in particular, I mean, there's going to be an either or judgment that'll have to be made on any of those amounts, basically, is kind of where we are.
Yes, correct.
so perhaps we should dispose of those initially because it's a tighter universe.
Maybe.
Where, out of the green lighted ones in the 1.37 million, which ones are you accounting for as discretionary funds? Brothers in Blue, right?
Yes, Brothers in Blue, Western Kansas Child Advocacy Center, number 31. Number 38, the CASA Association. 39, Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. 40 and 41, the Department of Corrections applications. And 44, Avenue of Life.
Okay.
Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, not Avenue of Life. They had a
Midway.
local jurisdiction waiver included at their request.
Please.
And for that, Matt, oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's
The Western Kansas CAC had some waivers, so we were able to count, I have to find my note, around, I want to say 76% of their requests can be considered passed through the locals. They serve like a 36 county region, and they had waivers from about 3/4 of the counties that they serve.
Secretary.
I suggest we take a break for a minute, give everybody a break.
I think that's an excellent idea. The secretary would like a break. Why don't we, how long would we like? 10 minutes, 15? Let's reconvene in this room at a quarter till noon. That's about 10 minutes till now. 11:45. We're in recess.
ready to reconvene here?
All right, the hour of 11:45 having arrived, we'll resume this meeting of the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. We'll pick up where we left off. I think perhaps based on the discussion that led up to the break, it might be most efficient to focus first on the trade-offs we're going to have to decide with respect to the discretionary funding. Even knowing that we don't have perhaps a precise number, we generally know that the ones that aren't in right now that would need discretionary funding, which would be the courts, the KBI, those are really probably the two, aren't they? If they are to go in either wholly or in part, they are going to displace somebody who's already in and is getting discretionary funding, either in whole or in part. And those would be the Brothers in Blue, the Western Kansas Child Advocacy Center, although that's a relatively small amount of discretionary funding, as I understand it. It's probably 40,000, give or take, maybe a little more. It's not the 177 because of the proration between the two pots. Kansas CASA, the KCSDV, or the two line items for the Department of Corrections at 186 and 67. And I think that's it. So that's the threshold decision with respect to funding the court request in whole or in part, the KBI request in whole or in part, is are we able to find a way to shoehorn it in by reducing something else, or are we not? And if we're not, then thanks for applying, but we can't make it work. On the other hand, if we can, obviously that would be, I think, at least ideal. If I remember correctly, Jill, there is no discretionary money left. Is that correct? We have committed it fully.
Yes, above and beyond what is available. Yes.
We have overcommitted it. All right. Director, I don't recall, I know we had this discussion with the judicial branch, but I don't recall if we had it with KBI. Is there a partial funding option that's actually helpful? Or is it sort of you got to have the money or it doesn't do you any good?
Where we're at.
And the judicial branch, I may be remembering it incorrectly, but there was a partial funding option discussed that cost $211,000. Is that correct?
My recollection is the 211,000 was a partial funding option that the staff came to after eliminating some disqualifying items. Beyond that, I think there could be some partial funding as you break apart some of the pieces and initiatives in the application as well.
Okay. Well, I don't have a good suggestion, which is not good news for the two who are still standing when the music stops. But does anybody else have other emotion or suggestion?
I had a question just in terms of the other discretionary pieces, the Brothers in Blue and the Western Kansas Child Advocacy and those. Are they all, I know I could figure this out if I scroll through the big spreadsheet, but are they all repeats where we've done, or are any of them new applications where we have not funded them previously? They're all repeats. Yep. Well, that's
They
not
are
helpful at all.
Existing subgrantees.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, I would note that Brothers in Blue is a very good program. We have funded it with large amounts of money for many years, and it might be worth a discussion at some point with them. In fact, I think I've suggested this before. The council suggested before, one of your predecessors. You know, these grants are not intended to permanently fund operations of programs, and while the intensity of that reality is less pronounced when you're talking about relatively small amounts of money, it's much more pronounced when you're talking about large amounts of money. I recall when I started doing this, it was routine to fund the Southwest Kansas Drug Task Force out of these pots of money to the tune of $600 and some-ish thousand a year to the KBI, most of which passed through to task force officers. And the council finally gave direction that while the program was very valuable, it either needed to stand on its own, find alternate funding, or not. But and we ultimately stopped funding it. So I'm not prepared to say that quite as bright line to the brothers in blue, but it probably is worth discussing with them. Is there a way we can help them, a way they can find a way to stand on their own? Because they do consume a large amount of funding every year for ongoing sustained operations. I think that I'm not picking on them. It's just I think they're the only one that sort of fits that category. I guess the Western Kansas Child Advocacy Center does. It might be a little bit different, but maybe it's not. It's not sure quite where they would turn is part of the challenge. Yeah. Well,
Mr. General, I'm just having trouble identifying any of those other ones that, jump out as, well, that's the one we need to talk about, maybe cutting back this year or, starting that sort of weaning process. I don't know what the sense of the rest of the council is, but I'm coming up empty on where to start. I think that in particular, the judicial branch request for those to help with those specialty courts is something that I think is really important. And if we can find a way to provide some funding there, I would really like to do that. The KBI request I think is also very important, but let me make sure I understand. We're talking about potentially 3 of these testing machines, and this would be funding one of those. Is that correct? So the other 2, one of which would be grant funded, and hopefully that comes through, but we don't know. And then the other is SGF funded or some other. Yes, Okay. it is. Obviously that's important as well. It's maybe I would probably put it slightly below the judicial branch request just because we will have some testing capacity. It's the question of how quickly we're able to turn those around and how easy it is to get to those places geographically and all that. So if we can find one that gives us some room on the judicial branch piece, I think that's kind of what I'd like to pursue. But I frankly am coming up empty on where to start, if there is even a place to start there. It may just be that we need to keep that one in mind for next year as well. I don't know.
let me ask on that question, Jill, on the judicial branch piece. As I understand the request, it's to expand the footprint of specialty courts into areas they aren't currently operating. Is that, or is it to beef up ones that are already operating?
Both.
Both.
It is twofold.
Is there a pathway that would involve waivers from local jurisdictions that would be affected by this project that could get them out of the discretionary pot and into, I think you said there were 14 currently operating specialty courts. I don't know if that's 14 counties or more than 14 counties, depending on the judicial district, I suppose.
I don't know off the top of my head, and it's not a straight comparison. 14 courts in 12 judicial districts. Some judicial districts are single county, but some are not. So I would have to look at a map to determine which are single county. I do know off the top of my head, Johnson County is one of them. And Johnson County 10th Judicial District is a 1-to-1 ratio there. But I'd have to look at the map to determine if it's 12 or 20.
I don't know who the waiver would have to come from. I'm not sure how that would work.
I'll see if I can pull up the FAQ for this, but I believe the language says city or county jurisdiction. I'm sorry, having a hard time with that. But I can see if I can verify that.
So if that were true, I'm going to press you, even though it's unfair because you haven't had a chance to look at it. But, so let's game that out. Let's assume it were county for purposes of discussion, because that's probably the simplest. I mean, if there were a way to pare back the judicial branch request, I'm going to just make up a number. I'm not advocating this, say 100,000 because it's a round number, and to focus it on specialty courts in 8 counties. Probably not a good way to do that because you're talking data crunching, so you need to be across the face. So you focus it on the specialty courts in the 14 counties that currently have them, plus, let's say, 5 more that we hope are going to happen as a result of this effort. So we got 19 counties. If you could get those 19 counties to execute waivers, it might be possible to get over into the discretionary pot of money instead of, into the pass-through pot of money instead of the discretionary, or I'm just way off base on that, or we just don't know.
I don't think I can say no yet, that would not work. It would be a challenge, I think, to get that. And I don't know, and maybe Amber can speak to this, given that we simply can't give the courts the funding to subgrant to other agencies or jurisdictions, I don't know if that would impact their desire or willingness to submit one of those waivers. And I'm not knowledgeable enough of the overall request and how it all interrelates with each other to know the answer to that.
At the risk of speaking out against my own interests on this, the waiver path that you suggest, General, may be problematic because some of these personnel costs are personnel costs across the street. And while the specialty courts would be situated in certain locations, with an effort of increasing the footprint, I don't know that there's an easy way to, link it back to a particular local jurisdiction in that regard, with it being a statewide position. To the sub-grantee part, I guess I'm a little bit curious from staff on where exactly that is, because with it being personnel, it's personnel funded out of the branch budget going to branch employees. Could you point me to where it would be a sub-granting funds?
I'm going to let staff help me clarify, but I believe it was in the other category in terms of how the budget request was laid out. And I believe that line item actually was labeled sub-grants to locals. And I can try to get that pulled up as well. No. Yes, it's in the other sub-grantee funding for specialty courts, $130,000. And also a grant to assist 10th Judicial District for $27,000. So the sum of those $157,000 is what we would not be able to fund. They would need to apply directly to us. I'm sorry? Well, I don't think, I'm not sure the pages got included in this. If you go up to page 2, there's a summary. And under other, there's the 157,000. But you're correct, I don't see where those pages got included in the scan. But we do have it pulled up, so I could read off the detail if you'd like.
Well, absent somebody's creative game plan here, I'm not seeing a way to get either the courts or the Bureau into this, or a steel cage match with the secretary, and that's probably not consistent with the council's rules. So,
Mr. Chairman, just to make things easier here, let's abide by the recommendations of staff and all withdraw.
okay, very well. We'll be glad to entertain a judicial branch suggestion on how to get there, but absent coming up with one, I don't see it. So I think that's sort of hit the wall on that. So let's turn our attention then to the remaining funds. So I have an idea. I don't know if it's a good idea. And it would certainly need to be math checked by people who are not me. But I believe we have approximately $500,000 over in headspace. And I believe it is the case that if one were to add up all of the yellow for technology items that we marked in the full group, not the other two that were yellow for reasons other than technology, but the yellow text, that would be number 11, number 16, number 22, and number 45. And if one were then to add the 3 staff level recommendations from the partial group, which would be number 14, number 23, and number 26, I believe the sum of that is going to be very close to the available headspace. So perhaps there's a path we want to look at involving that.
Okay, so inclusive of the group from the full recommendations, essentially it's not including number 5 and number 43 to go at it from a different direction. I have that's 1,815,159.
See, this is why you do the math and I don't, because that's not a ballpark of where I was.
And that's including the 3 in the partial, correct?
Yes.
Sorry, Jill, is that a total? We would totally.
Sorry, the speaker must be over here.
Is that 1.8 number including the discretionary amounts and everything? Or is that okay, so general, that's,
Oh, that is
I think,
correct.
I think we still have some room.
You're right.
Yeah.
So what was the number again? I was looking at the sum of those items, not the sum of those items plus what we've already approved. So we're just thinking
okay,
different things. Sorry.
okay.
You're looking
My
at the big picture
apologies.
bottom line, and I'm just
Yeah.
looking at the next step. So thank you. Anyway, what was the number of the?
That amount was 1,815,159.
Okay. So if we were to do that, that gets us, very close. I suppose one procedural way to proceed would be we could go ahead and essentially tentatively approve that, essentially turn those items to green. And then if there are individual changes that members of the council want to pursue, at least we're not looking at these sort of lumps of ins and outs. We can look at motions or suggestions for individual trade-offs might help us to get to closure.
Mhm.
Any member of the council have a concern with that process? Okay. Then why don't we, for our functioning purposes, let's turn everything Joe just suggested, those 1, 2, 3, 4 yellow items from the full that were tech-based, plus those 3 partial staff recommendations from the partial. Let's move them into our green category, which takes our total to 1.815 or whatever you just told us. And that plus not funding the Bureau's request and not funding the court request, I think gets us very close to what could be a finished product. Now it's just a matter of sort of topping off if there are individual changes council members would like to consider or additional requests that we could either fit in or that we could tweak something that's in order to fit in, or if there's anything, that is not in that green basket that the council thinks ought to be, then we can look at trade-offs. Something comes in, comes out, but it's a more focused closing discussion here. So is that an agreeable next step to take for the council? I believe it is. And Jill, we now have a longer green basket. The total is 1.815-ish million. And I would open it up for whether any member of the council wants to discuss or propose any further changes, considerations.
Can I ask a question? Anything we don't appropriate this year, we potentially could appropriate next year. It rolls over, correct?
Yes, that would be correct.
And if it's if it's discretionary money this year and it rolls over, which we're not going to have, it would be discretionary next year. If it's local pass-through money that rolls over, those same restrictions would apply next year. Is that right? Or does it become discretionary next year?
No, it does
Okay.
not become discretionary. The only way that that would not be a straight rule is if we're funding some that meet one of the thresholds, sort of with that spillover discretionary, which is not the case in this year's scenario, and they maybe didn't spend it all. But overall, by the time we close the federal award, in the usually 3 years that we're spending from it, we need to meet those thresholds.
Jill or council, just again, looking at the math, not that we have to spend everything, but on the other hand, this is not a budgeting committee. This is an allocation committee. The budgeting decision has already been made and the money is available. So there is a little bit of room left, about 70-ish thousand. Am I right on maybe a little shade under that? So out of the items that we have looked at that we've so far elected not to fund, there are a couple that could fit in there. I'm not prepared to advocate to go in. I'm just saying we ought to look at it. Certainly the City of Valley Center request number 32, $42,000 is within the available amount. Also number 4, the Bourbon County Sheriff's Office request is way over, but if I remember correctly, there was some discussion, we'd want to confirm that that was a 2-person request and it could be halved perhaps by going to 1, and that amount would fit in there. That would actually accommodate everything, right, except the City of Wichita Police Department, which appears to me a very valuable request, but the point was made that Wichita has a unique pathway to access these funds other than through this council that many of the other applicants don't. Let's see, what else am I missing here? I think that's it. Have I missed any, Jill, just in terms of the checklist?
Well, I'm not sure all the criteria you were using, but I guess I would say potentially if you still wanted to discuss the 2 in the full that are currently not included in that
Fair point. Yep.
dollar amount.
That's a very good point. I'm glad you caught that. So the universe we'd be looking at now in terms of, filling the remaining piece would be number 5, number 45, number 4, and number 32. That would be the universe. And we probably have room for 1 or possibly 2, depending on how the parts fit.
General, I'm trying to remember on number 5, the Sac and Fox, and number 45, Edwardsville. I can just look them up again and answer my own question, I suppose. But was there a functional difference? Why were they not included in our yellow bucket initially, or did we include them?
Right. Number 5, that was the one that I was a little puzzled by. It was the first one I mentioned. Turns out to be the only one I had these concerns on, but I didn't know that at the time. But it was an incomplete application that didn't on its face fit into our priority areas. And there were a significant number of shortcomings identified in the staff review, most of which, but not all of which, relate to the appearance of a cut and paste application from last year that was not updated in some material ways. And then, of course, that one also had the not even an attempt to answer the Homeland Security question, which is, I think, concerning. It's sort of unique in that regard that it had so many questions. 45, I don't think had those questions. I'm trying to remember. Let me look real quick.
Chair, if I may. I
Please.
think 45 did go into the, 45 did go into the hold yellow for tech considerations. I think it was 43.
You're right. I'm sorry. It was 43. Thank you for correcting me on that. You're right. Yeah, 43 should have been the look, not 40. 45 is in. 43 is the one that's on the bubble or at issue. And that had different but similar types of issues. You had an incomplete application. It was not immediately apparent how the request fit the priority areas, although certainly one could articulate a connection. So personally, I wouldn't see that as disqualifying, but it wasn't immediately apparent on its face. There were several technical deficiencies. On the other hand, most of those can be cured on the back end as conditions upon the funding. So I'm not sure that needs to be disqualifying. I mean, one could do, for example, number 43 and number 32 if we wanted to do that one. I actually don't remember exactly what the issues were in that. And that was just purely a mathematical assessment. Right. I mean, that was the one, the Valley Center issue. I mean, it struck me on its face as it's squarely within types of priorities the council has set. We're talking about advocate to support victims of crime and mental illness. There were a variety of, I'll characterize them as mechanical questions that were left unanswered from both the reviewer and the staff questions. A potential supplanting concern because it appears that the applicant has an internal candidate for this new position. So they'd have to commit to backfill the position that internal candidate currently has to avoid a supplanting issue, if I understand that correctly. There was a DHS issue, although it wasn't their failure to submit, it was the format. And so it sounds as if that could be cured on the back end. I don't have strong feelings on it. I'm just trying to get as much money out to as many applicants as we can, since that's our mission. So
I would have, I mean, if staff is comfortable with being able to cure some of the issues on the application side and the paperwork side on the back end, I think I wouldn't have any problem with adding, would you say 32 and
43.
and 43?
I would get 2 more applicants and assistants. Is there any concern about taking that step? All right, let's turn those numbers 32 and 43 green as well. Where does that put us?
Half a second here.
You can have all the time you need.
Okay, it looks like that puts us at 1,879,614.
No, that's pretty good. Council, is there a desire to work further on our list? We'll have Jill go over it and we'll do our final, make sure we're all comfortable and approve. But at this point, does anybody have anything left on the table that they want to be sure the council addresses or considers or wording changes?
I'm just looking through the list here to see if there was something for $10,000 we could, throw in, but I think the rest of the requests are significantly beyond that.
Yeah.
So I feel like we're probably in a good spot.
What was the request from the Gardner PD?
That's the only one I was just thinking, Gardner.
We can take a look. I don't know what it was. We haven't looked at it yet. Looks like they want to stand up. Do they want to stand up or expand and support an existing peer support program? We'll certainly leave it to the council. I could go either way on it. It's perhaps not squarely within our priority areas. It seems a worthy program, but Director.
I guess a question for Jill, if she remembers it all here. But the indication is that there was a request for associated uniforms. Is that what was pulled back and this remains just a training request? Is that the lower amount recommended?
Yeah, that is their full request. We didn't have a recommended amount for this one, that $5,985, that is their full request.
So no subtraction was made with regard to uniforms or anything along those lines? Well, Mr. Chairman, I think in the interest of getting as much funding out there as possible, I would suggest we add the peer support program for Gardner PD.
I'd agree with that. No sense in saving it for a rainy day right now.
Hey,
So
I'm all right with that. Any disagreement on the council? Well, tell Gardner PD they won the lottery. They were the right size at the right time and the right deliberation.
Jill, could I ask again, the balance of any remaining funds, that does roll over to next year?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, council, with that, I think we are very tight on money versus availability. Jill, do you want to give us a run through of what you think we have just tentatively agreed to do, and then we can vote on whether in fact to do that?
Certainly. Okay, and I will go in order of application number, not by full versus partial deny, if that's okay with the council.
Okay.
Number 6, Andover Police Department, 3,400. Crawford, number 7, Crawford County Sheriff's Office, 31,753. Number 9, Northwest Kansas Community Corrections, 87,837. Number 11, Jackson County Sheriff's Office, 142,542. Number 12, Gardner Police Department, 5,985. Number 14, One Heart Project, 69,470. Number 16, Westwood Police Department, 75,956. 17, Brothers in Blue Reentry, 280,934. Number 19, 5th Judicial District Community Corrections, 43,212. 22, Marysville Police Department, 38,661. Number 23, Miami County Sheriff's Office, 22,979. Number 26, Coffeyville Police Department, $82,035. 28, Pratt Police Department, $10,332. Number 30, 28th Judicial District Community Corrections, $91,461. 31, Western Kansas Child Advocacy Center, $177,105. 32, City of Valley Center Police Department, $42,610. 38, Kansas CASA Association, $34,420. Number 39, Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence, $87,535. Number 40, Kansas Department of Corrections for the Office of Victim Services, $186,691. Number 41, Kansas Department of Corrections for Parole Services, $67,461. Number 43, Oxford Police Department, $21,845. 44, Avenue of Life, $238,940. And number 45, Edwardsville Police Department, $42,435.
For a grand total of?
That is for a total of $1,885,599.
Quick question. So the amounts left over from previous fiscal years, do those largely represent money that was appropriated or granted, but then just wasn't spent for some reason and has come back to us? Or does that money represent money that was not appropriated in the first place? If that makes sense.
Both.
Okay.
I can pull it up, I think, in just a second and let you know for sure if you'd like. But I know that there was some funding that the council left on the table last year, a small amount, in case the award, our federal award, were to go down like it did. But there was also, well, let me see what I can access quickly here. I want to be able to answer that question. And again, the amounts available and what might have been not obligated last year is made up of different federal years. But what we included as unspent dollars. It looks like, oops, don't fail me here. A little over 100,000, maybe?
How much?
Out of the two, we awarded just over 2 million last year, I believe, and it was a little over $100,000, it looks like, that they're projecting to have left over.
Thank you.
Very good. Council, it appears we may be near the end of our work today. Short of approving what we've just done, is there anything else that any member of the council would like to discuss, consider, or bring before us this part of our work? Very well, then I think it would be appropriate to have a motion to approve the items that Jill just read to us. And the approval would be subject to each awardee, of course, satisfying as a condition of receiving the funds, all of the necessary conditions. And I would emphasize specifically including the DHS provisions, which are a bright line disqualifier, in addition to the others that must be met. There be a motion to that effect?
I'll make that motion, Mr. Chairman.
It's been moved by the secretary, seconded by Clay. Jill?
Because you're doing all of them together, I think we need to have the minutes reflect that corrections is included in that list.
Oh, that's an excellent point. Secretary withdraws his motion.
Sorry about
It's an excellent catch. Director, you got blanked. You can make the motion. Yeah. We'll have the director and the judicial branch be magnanimous. How's that? That sounds good. It's been moved by, seconded by. All right, you. Okay. Is there discussion?
question, Mr. Chairman. So when it comes to a vote, could we parcel out the corrections separate so I don't vote on that?
I would think the minutes can reflect, if you desire, that you're abstaining on items related to your agency, but voting on the others if that's agreeable to the council. Is there a reason not to? Yeah. It's like both voting in the Senate. It's great. All right. Very good. Question is on the motion to approve, subject to everybody coming into full compliance with the requirements. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it. The motion carries. The minutes will reflect Secretary Zamuta's not voting on those particular items. Is there any new business to come before the council? Hearing none, is there a motion to adjourn? It's been moved by Director Thompson, seconded by Clay. Discussion on that motion. Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Carries. We are adjourned. I want to thank you very much for your very, very good work and expeditious work getting this done today. Thank you.
Good job, staff. Appreciate you.
Appreciate it very much.